noisiest pieces of music ever written, the 1812 Overture by Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky, a celebration of the victory of the Russian peoples over the armies of Napoleon. It is scored for full orchestra, chorus, brass band, cannons, and church bells. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia, and by midwinter, his armies entered Moscow. But the Russians had abandoned the city and set it afire. With his supply lines overextended and his winter quarters in flames, Napoleon was forced into a long and disastrous retreat across the frozen plains of Russia. His armies never recovered, and that winter of 1812 effectively marked the end of his hopes of world conquest. Almost 70 years later, Tchaikovsky wrote this piece, intending it for outside performance. With its spectacular percussive effects, it's not surprising it's become a favorite for the producers of sound spectacular phonograph records. It's also a favorite of Mr. Nixon's. As we told you, he first heard it in Philadelphia, played by this orchestra in 1970. For the performance, the Philadelphia Orchestra and the chorale are joined by the Valley Forge Military Academy Band, made up of young men 15 to 20 years old, who are drawn from all over the nation and awarded scholarships for their musical skills. The band's become known as the Philadelphia Orchestra of Military Bands, as it's often performed with Mr. Ormandy and performed the 1812 with him when Mr. Nixon heard it 3 years ago. The band is under the direction of Colonel D. Keith Feltham. Well, how do they make the noise of the cannon going off? Mr. Ormandy, in fact, I have here a memo that he passed out to the inaugural committee asking for 2 men with repeating shotguns to fire blanks into oil drums. But in a discussion with the inaugural committee, they decided to make do this evening with drums instead. The applause is for the Valley Forge Military Band, whose young members have just come on. And in a moment, Eugene Ormandy will be returning to the podium to conduct this huge ensemble in Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. It will be President Nixon, standing to applaud the piece that he personally requested that Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra play this evening, Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. Colonel Feltham, director of the Valley Forge Military Academy Band, receiving applause with Roger Wagner, whose chorale sang it, and Eugene Ormandy, conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra. Mrs. Mamie Eisenhower, the widow of the late president, on President Nixon's left. Mrs. Nixon on the right. Billy Graham and his wife behind. The conclusion of this concert honoring the second inauguration of President Nixon. Certainly been an enthusiastic audience this evening. Every piece of music has been wildly applauded, and they've all received standing ovations. Colonel Feltham, Roger Wagner, Eugene Ormandy. Now the audience and the orchestra. Remaining seated. The idea was they would remain seated until the presidential party had left. Mr. Nixon doesn't seem in any hurry to go. Another round of applause. Now the members of the audience are turning and applauding the president and his family. Everybody's applauding everybody. John Connally and Mrs. Connally, the former governor of Texas, now a supporter of President Nixon in the recent campaign. Julie Nixon Eisenhower and Tricia Nixon Cox. Leaving. Well, that's the end of the music. There is some suggestion that the president might come around on stage or backstage and talk to the musicians. But that was the rumor earlier in the day, but then it was discovered that the president would not do that. And so, to Washington on the eve of the inauguration, as Richard Nixon goes back to the White House. Perhaps knowing the infinite pains he always takes with preparing a major speech, it's not far-fetched to think that later this evening, before going to bed, he may be going over once again the inaugural address he'll deliver at the Capitol tomorrow, and which will set the tone for the next 4 years of his administration. After his swearing in and that speech and a luncheon with congressional leaders in Capitol Hill, Mr. Nixon will lead the traditional inaugural parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. The weather this year promises to be unusually mild. Washington has been basking this past week in temperatures in the mid-60s. Tomorrow evening, the Kennedy Center and other government buildings will see the massive inaugural ball divided into 5 parts to accommodate the 40,000 people expected. Although the mood in Washington tonight, in these scheduled events with invited guests, is festive, the general mood in the Capitol is not particularly gay for this inauguration. Obviously, that's due partly to public recognition that this is not a new, fresh, incoming administration, but a resumed one they already know. But considering the extent of Mr. Nixon's election victory, the mood here is sober and unexcited. A lot of commentators have said that. Partly also due to the disappointment in Congress and the general public that the expected peace in Vietnam wasn't realized. Perhaps the glamour surrounding all these events tonight and tomorrow will help generate some excitement. But I think there must be a lot of people who will be anxious to hear whether Mr. Nixon breaks his silence on Vietnam tomorrow and alludes to what appears to be a new, bright prospect for peace. Clearly, if he was able to say something about that, the whole country would make tomorrow a day of real celebration and give the concerts and the ceremonies and the parades a double justification. This is Robert McNeil. Good night from Washington.
This program was made possible by a grant from the Alcoa Foundation.